Nobody believed Margaret Chen when she came back from the Cascade Mountains in October of 2019. Not her colleagues at Ridgefield Elementary, where she had taught fourth-grade science for 11 years. Not her sister, who drove 4 hours to meet her at the trailhead and found her sitting on the hood of her car with mud on her boots and a look in her eyes that she would later describe to investigators as the look of someone who has seen a thing that does not fit inside any category they previously owned. Not the 2 graduate students from the University of Washington who had organized the expedition and who filed their official report 3 weeks later with language so carefully neutral it drained every drop of what had actually happened out of the events they were describing. Margaret Chen believed it. She had been there. This is the story of what happened in the Cascade Range during a 7-day research expedition in the fall of 2019. Told through field notes, audio recordings, thermal imaging captures, physical evidence collected on site, and the direct testimony of the 3 individuals who walked into those mountains looking for signs of an unclassified primate and found something that none of their training had prepared them for. The Cascades have one of the highest concentrations of reported Sasquatch activity in North America. The Pacific Northwest corridor running from Northern California through Oregon and Washington into British Columbia accounts for approximately 31% of all credible reported sightings logged in the North American Wood Ape Conservancy database, which as of 2023 holds over 7,000 individual reports spanning more than a century of documented encounters. Of those 7,000 reports, roughly 400 involve prolonged observation periods exceeding 5 minutes. Of those 400, 62 involve what researchers classify as interactive behavior, meaning the subject appeared to respond to or initiate contact with the observer rather than simply being observed. Margaret Chen's encounter falls in that last category. She was 41 years old at the time. She had a master's degree in environmental science from Oregon State and had spent 11 years teaching elementary school science because, as she told the field journal she kept throughout the expedition, she believed that the most important thing you could give a child was the habit of looking at the world and asking why. She had been following Sasquatch research as a serious amateur for 6 years, beginning after a sighting of her own in the summer of 2013 near Mount Hood that she had never reported officially, and had never told anyone about except her sister, who had listened carefully and then suggested she speak to a therapist, which Margaret had declined. She had instead started reading everything. The Patterson-Gimlin film analysis papers, the Skookum cast documentation from 2000, the thermal capture studies conducted by the Olympic Project between 2008 and 2014, the acoustic research published by the Sierra Sounds investigators. She had cross-referenced sighting databases, plotted geographical clusters, mapped seasonal movement patterns against the topography of known old-growth forest corridors. By 2019, she was not a believer in the casual sense. She was a researcher in everything but institutional affiliation, and when Dr. Kevin Marr at the University of Washington posted a call for expedition volunteers with field experience in scientific methodology, she applied with a 12-page research summary and a list of references that made Marr call her back within the hour. The expedition launched from the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest staging area on October 3rd. 7 days. Base camp at 4,600 feet elevation in a section of old-growth Douglas fir that Marr had identified through aerial thermal surveys as showing anomalous heat signatures during the previous 2 winters. Signatures that did not correspond to known wildlife patterns and that appeared in 3 separate captures taken 14 months apart to originate from the same half-mile corridor of terrain. Day 1 was ordinary. Setup, perimeter documentation, baseline acoustic recording. The forest in October at that elevation is a specific kind of quiet. Not the absence of sound, but the presence of a sound that is entirely itself. Wind in the upper firs, the distant percussion of a woodpecker somewhere east of camp, the occasional crack of something moving in the understory that could be deer or elk or the settling of old wood. Margaret noted in her field journal that the forest felt watched. She wrote this without drama, as a simple observational data point, the way you note temperature or cloud cover. The forest felt watched. She had felt this before in other forests and had learned not to dismiss it as imagination because imagination does not consistently orient itself in the same direction, and this feeling had a direction. It came from the north slope. She noted the direction. She noted the time. She went to sleep. Day 2 brought the first physical evidence. Dr. Marr found the tracks at 6:40 in the morning, 40 meters north of the camp perimeter, in a section of soft ground near a seasonal creek that had enough moisture remaining from September rains to hold an impression cleanly. 15.5 inches. Bipedal. Stride length of 58 inches, which for a human would require a leg length of approximately 4 feet. The dermal ridge detail in the 3 clearest impressions was sufficient for casting, and Marr spent the better part of the morning on his knees in the creek mud with dental stone and a level and a camera, while Margaret documented the approach path and the graduate student, a 24-year-old named Daniel Park, ran the measurements 3 times and kept getting the same numbers and kept writing them down with the expression of someone whose dissertation had just become considerably more complicated. Margaret photographed the tracks from every angle. She photographed the surrounding terrain. She measured the distance between impressions and calculated the pace and stood in the track line herself, placing her own size 8 boot inside the impression for scale, and the track swallowed her foot and left 4 inches of empty space on every side. Whatever had made these tracks had walked through this creek bed sometime in the night. It had walked north to south toward the camp. It had stopped based on the depth variation in the final 2 impressions approximately 30 meters from the nearest tent. Then it had turned and walked back north into the old growth, and the forest had closed behind it and left nothing but the marks in the mud and the number 58 written in Daniel Park's field notebook, and the feeling that Margaret Chen had noted the night before and noted again now, with the same flat precision. The north slope. Still watching. On the evening of day 2 at approximately 9:15, the acoustic array recorded something. The array consisted of 4 directional microphones placed at the cardinal points of the camp perimeter, feeding into a central recorder that Marr monitored from his tent. The recording made at 9:17 on the evening of October 4th, later analyzed by Dr. Sandra Holt at the Oregon Bioacoustics Laboratory, is 42 seconds long. It begins with 11 seconds of standard ambient forest sound, wind and insect activity at the low end of the frequency range, and then at second 12 it introduces a vocalization. Dr. Holt's analysis report, submitted to the North American Wood Ape Conservancy in February of 2020, describes the vocalization as follows. Single source, stationary origin, estimated distance from nearest microphone of 80 to 120 meters. Fundamental frequency between 240 and 260 Hz, below the range of any known primate in the Pacific Northwest. Duration 21 seconds with no pause for respiration, which Dr. Holt notes is physiologically inconsistent with any known mammal of the estimated size required to produce the recorded frequency. Harmonic overtones at multiples of the fundamental consistent with a large resonating chest cavity. No match in the laboratory's database of 4,000 documented wildlife vocalizations. In the camp, when it happened, nobody spoke for a long time after it ended. Daniel Park later described it as the sound of something enormous being very, very quiet. He said this in the debrief and could not explain what he meant by it, only that the sound had the quality of restraint, of a large thing producing a small fraction of what it was capable of producing, and that this quality was more unsettling than volume would have been. Margaret Chen wrote 3 words in her field journal at 9:22 that evening. "It knows we're here." She underlined it once, then she closed the journal and sat outside her tent in the cold October dark and listened to the forest listening back. And she did not feel afraid, which was the thing she kept returning to in the weeks and months afterward when she tried to explain what those 7 days had done to her. She did not feel afraid. She felt with a clarity that had no rational foundation, and that she was too good a scientist to pretend was data and too honest a person to dismiss, that whatever was in the tree line to the north of camp was not a threat. It was curious, about the camp, about the equipment, about the 3 people who had come into its territory with microphones and dental stone and field journals and were writing everything down. About her specifically. She believed this then and she believes it now. The tracks on day 3 confirmed a pattern, 2 sets this time, found on the east approach to camp at first light, and a 3rd set discovered by Margaret herself when she walked the north perimeter at 7 in the morning and found, pressed into the soft earth at the base of a large Douglas fir at the edge of the tree line, a single impression so fresh that the compressed soil at its edges had not yet dried. She crouched over it with her measuring tape and her camera in the cold morning air moving around her through the old growth, and she understood, looking at the direction and depth of that single print, that whatever had made it had been standing at the tree line sometime in the very early morning. Standing. Watching the camp. She looked up from the impression into the forest. The old growth at that hour is deep shadow between the fir columns, green going to black 20 feet in, the kind of dark that could hold anything. She looked into it for a long moment. She did not see anything. She did not hear anything, but the feeling was so strong that she said something, out loud, to the trees. She said, "I see the tracks. I know you've been here." The forest was quiet. The wind moved in the canopy far above her. Then, from somewhere in the dark between the trees at a distance she estimated later as between 60 and 80 feet, something moved. Not a sound, a movement. The specific movement of a large mass shifting its weight, the kind of movement that produces a sensation rather than a noise, a pressure change, a displacement of air. There and then still again in the space of 2 seconds. Margaret Chen did not move for a long time. Then she took out her field journal and wrote the time and the location and the description of the movement and the direction and the ambient conditions, and she wrote it all down in the precise, methodical handwriting of a woman who had spent 11 years teaching children to look at the world and ask why. And when she had written everything, she stood up and walked back to camp. She told Mar about the tracks. She did not tell him what she had said to the trees or about the movement in the dark. Some data, she was beginning to understand, does not belong in a shared field report. Some data belongs only to the person who was standing in the cold morning air at the edge of the tree line when it happened, with the impression of an enormous foot in the soil at her feet and the certainty, unfounded and absolute, that something in the old growth had come to look at her specifically, and had come back again, and again, and was there still. Day 4 produced the thermal footage. The FLIR unit was Mars, a research-grade, forward-looking infrared camera he had borrowed from the university's wildlife biology department, and which had been running on a motion-activated mount on the north perimeter since day 1 without capturing anything beyond deer, and what appeared to be a black bear moving through the understory on the second night. On the morning of day 4, Mar pulled the overnight captures and found 13 seconds of footage taken at 3:41 in the morning. The footage shows the tree line at the northern edge of camp in infrared. For the first 4 seconds, it shows nothing unusual: the cold signature of the fir trunks, the slightly warmer ground temperature where the soil retains the day's heat, the consistent gray-black of the ambient cold air. Then at second 5, a heat signature appears at the left edge of the frame, partially occluded by a large fir trunk, and it does not move for the remaining 8 seconds of the capture before the motion trigger's recording window closes. The signature is large. Mars' field estimate based on the known diameter of the fir trunk used as a reference point puts the visible portion of the heat source at approximately 4 feet wide and the height of the visible signature above the ground at between 7 and 9 feet. The temperature differential from ambient is consistent with a large, warm-blooded mammal. The shape is irregular in the way of a living thing rather than a mechanical heat source. It does not move. In 8 seconds of footage, it does not move at all. Dr. Marr sent the footage to Dr. Patricia Webb at the Center for Fortean Zoology's North American Research Division in December of 2019. Webb's analysis, which she shared with the expedition team in March of 2020, notes 3 things of particular significance. First, the heat signature's temperature profile is consistent with a primate rather than a bear or cervid based on the surface temperature distribution pattern across the visible area. Second, the absolute stillness of the subject over the 8-second capture suggests deliberate behavior, an animal capable of voluntary sustained motionlessness, which is not characteristic of bear or deer behavior in the presence of an unfamiliar stimulus. Third, and most unusually, the camera's motion trigger requires a minimum movement threshold to activate. Whatever produced the heat signature had moved enough to trigger the recording and then immediately became still, which Webb describes in her analysis as behaviorally sophisticated, consistent with an animal that understood it had triggered something and chose to stop moving in response. She does not use the word intelligence in her report. Researchers in this field learn early which words they cannot afford to use, but the word sits in the white space around her careful language the way a shape sits in darkness when your eyes have adjusted, present and unmistakable without being directly stated. Margaret read Webb's analysis 3 times when it arrived. She read the section about deliberate stillness 4 times. She thought about the Douglas fir at the edge of the tree line on day 3 morning. The single fresh impression in the soil, the way she had spoken to the trees in the forest had gone very still, and then the dark between the fir columns had moved with the specific weight of something very large choosing to stop moving. The FLIR footage had been taken 6 hours after she had spoken to the trees. The heat signature had been standing at the north perimeter in the cold dark at 3:41 in the morning, not moving, watching the camp. Margaret Chen wrote in her private journal that night, and did not share what she wrote with Marr or with Daniel Park, because some things are not field data, and are not bioacoustics analysis, and are not thermal imagery, and cannot be submitted to a laboratory or published in a conservancy database. Some things are just the truth of what it feels like to be in a specific place at a specific time and to understand, with a certainty that precedes evidence and survives every attempt to rationalize it away, that you are being specifically regarded, not observed, not monitored, regarded, the way one thinking thing regards another. She wrote, "I think it has been watching me since the first night, not the camp. Me." She wrote, "I do not know what to do with that." Then she put the journal away and went to sleep in the cold tent at 4,600 feet in the Cascades and listened to the forest outside and did not hear anything. And the not hearing felt different now than it had on day 1. On day 1, the quiet had been the forest being itself. Now the quiet had a presence in it, something that was choosing in the dark outside the tent walls to be quiet. She slept better than she had any right to. Day 5 was when everything changed. The research protocol for day 5 included a solo transect walk for each team member, a standard methodology in field research designed to collect individual observational data without the social noise of group movement. Each person walked a pre-mapped route alone, carrying audio recording equipment and a field journal for 4 hours. Margaret's route ran north and northeast from the base camp into the old growth above the tree line where the fir canopy closed overhead, and the light came through in long, cold shafts, and the ground was soft with decades of needlefall. She walked for 2 hours without incident. She recorded ambient sound. She noted tracks she could not identify and photographed them. She found a tree structure, 2 large firs with their upper branches woven together in a configuration that does not occur naturally, which field researchers in the Pacific Northwest have been documenting since the 1970s as a possible territorial marker. She photographed it from 6 angles and noted the estimated height of the lowest structural elements, approximately 14 feet, which would require the maker to be operating at or above that height, and she filed this observation away with all the others and kept walking. At the 2-hour mark, she stopped to eat and consult her map. She was sitting on a fallen log at the edge of a small clearing when she smelled it. The smell associated with Sasquatch encounters in field reports is one of the most consistent descriptors in the database, appearing across decades of accounts from individuals with no connection to each other in geographically separate locations under widely varying conditions. It is described variously as musky, sulfurous like a wet animal, but amplified like something between a skunk and a dog that has been out in the rain. Deeply biological in a way that triggers an atavistic response in the observer. A precognitive recognition of proximity to something large and alive and not human. Margaret had read every one of those descriptions. When the smell reached her on the fallen log at the edge of the clearing, she recognized it in exactly the way the reports described, not as unfamiliar but as deeply, primally familiar. The way things are familiar that exist in the oldest registers of human neurological processing, below language, before language, in the part of the brain that was mapping large predators in old-growth forests for hundreds of thousands of years before anyone thought to write it down. She did not move. She had read enough to know that sudden movement was the wrong response. She sat on the fallen log with her field journal on her knee and her recording equipment running in her jacket pocket, and she breathed slowly and looked at the tree line across the clearing, and waited. It came out of the trees at the northeast corner of the clearing. Later, in her official account submitted to the North American Wood Ape Conservancy, she described it in the precise language of a trained observer. Bipedal. Height estimated between 8 and 9 feet based on comparison to the known height of adjacent vegetation. Weight estimated at 400 pounds minimum based on the depth of ground impressions observed in subsequent analysis. Hair coverage full body, dark brown to black, longer on the upper body and head. Facial features consistent with a large non-human primate. Movement fluid, weight forward, the characteristic bent knee gait documented in the Patterson-Gimlin footage and in multiple subsequent video captures considered credible by researchers. It stopped at the northeast edge of the clearing, approximately 40 feet from where she sat. It looked at her. She looked at it. This lasted, according to the timestamp on her audio recorder, for 1 minute and 17 seconds. She did not run. She did not make a sound. She sat on the fallen log in the cold October light in the old growth above 4,600 feet, and she looked at the thing that the academic establishment did not believe existed, and that 7,000 reports in a database and 40 years of research by people who had dedicated their careers to the question had been trying to prove was real, and it stood at the edge of the clearing and looked back at her with dark eyes that she described in her private journal. Not her official account, in the only language she could find for it, as eyes that knew what they were looking at. Then it turned and walked back into the trees. It did not run. It walked, unhurried. The old growth took it back in the way old growth takes things, quietly and completely. And the clearing was empty, and the cold air moved through it. And the amber October light came down through the fir canopy, and Margaret Chen sat on the fallen log for a long time without writing anything. When she finally opened her field journal, she wrote, Northeast corner clearing, transect route north, approximately 10:40 a.m. Visual contact, 1 minute 17 seconds. Subject, adult male, estimated 8 to 9 feet 400 pounds. Dark brown to black full body hair. Bipedal fluid gait. No aggressive behavior, no vocalization. Subject withdrew voluntarily into northeast tree line. Then she stopped writing and sat for another long time in the clearing. Then she wrote, "He looked at me like he had been waiting for me to get close enough to see him." Then she closed the journal and stood up and walked back to camp. And she did not tell Mar or Daniel Park what the official account would later confirm, and what her private journal already knew. The subject had not wandered into the clearing. The soil analysis conducted after the expedition by Dr. Marr's team identified approach tracks from the northeast that predated Margaret's arrival in the clearing by an estimated 30 to 60 minutes, based on moisture content and edge compression. The subject had come to the clearing first. It had positioned itself at the northeast tree line. It had waited. When Margaret Chen had sat down on the fallen log at the edge of that clearing, she had not stumbled across a Sasquatch in its natural habitat. She had walked into a meeting that had been arranged without her knowledge, in a clearing in the Cascade old growth at 4,600 feet, by something that had been watching the camp for 4 days, and had decided on the 5th morning that it was ready to be seen. The expedition ended on October 10th. Marr's research paper, submitted to 3 journals before finding a home in the Journal of Scientific Exploration in late 2020, was received with the usual mixture of methodological respect and institutional skepticism that characterizes the field. The thermal footage was analyzed and debated. The acoustic recording was cited in 2 subsequent papers. The track casts from day 2 are currently housed at the University of Washington's Natural History Collection, cataloged under Unidentified Primate, Pacific Northwest, 2019. Margaret Chen went back to Ridgefield Elementary in November of 2019 and taught the 4th grade unit on ecosystems for the 7th time and stood in front of 22 9-year-olds and told them that science was the practice of looking at the world honestly, including the parts that did not yet have names. She said this every year. In 2019, she meant it differently than she had before. She returned to the Cascades in the spring of 2020, and the summer, and the fall. She has returned every season since to the same territory, to the same old growth above the same elevation, with the same field journal and the same recording equipment and the same flat methodical handwriting that notes the time and the temperature and the direction of the wind, and everything the forest does and does not say. The tracks appear regularly. The acoustic array records things the bioacoustics laboratory cannot match. The thermal camera captures heat signatures that do not move. She has had 3 further visual encounters in 4 years. Each one lasted longer than the last. Each one was in a clearing she had not chosen, at a time she had not planned, and each time the approach tracks in the soil told the same story. She did not find the subject. The subject found her. This is the part Margaret Chen does not include in her official accounts, not because it is not true, but because it is the kind of true that the language of field research was not built to hold. But she includes it in the talks she now gives at Sasquatch symposia in Portland and Seattle, and once in Vancouver, standing at the front of conference rooms full of people who have seen things the world does not believe. And she says it plainly, the way she says everything. Something in the Cascade Range made a decision about her in October of 2019. It decided she was worth being seen by. She does not know why. She does not know what that decision means in whatever cognitive and social framework produces it. She does not know what the encounters mean to the subject, or what she represents to it, or whether representation is even the right concept to apply. She knows that she goes back. Every season she goes back, and every time she does, the clearing is never empty when she arrives. She has stopped being surprised by this. She has not stopped being changed by it. These are not the same thing, she tells the conference rooms. Surprise ends. Being changed by something that is real does not. The old growth holds its secrets the way it holds its history, in the rings of trees too large to put your arms around, in the depth of soil that remembers every weight that has ever pressed into it. In the dark between the fir columns where the light does not go and where something very large and very old and very patient has been living for longer than any database has been keeping count. Margaret Chen knows this. She has stood in that dark and had it look back at her with eyes that knew what they were seeing. And she has walked out of it and gone home and gone back and walked into it again. She will keep going back. The clearing is always there, the tracks are always fresh, and the thing that made them is always, she is certain, already waiting.